If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. I started out some podcast episodes a ways back talking about the lies of productivity, but I think I'm going to change to fables because the productivity things are just things we collectively believe without much evidence. Plus, I really don't think anybody's intentionally trying to mislead us. We just tend to move and act without much actual data on what's going to make us more productive. And this struck me because a couple of those fables collided with a post by Cal Newport recently. And his post had the evocative title of Productivity Rain Dances, which is a pretty humorous mental picture. We're kind of running around and doing things that don't really do much for us, apparently. These rain dances are those habits of work that we believe make us productive, but that actually don't. And when we have fables and rain dances, there's some overlap. So what I want to do today is explore Cal's post and investigate some of the things that we're doing, some of our practices, just to make sure that we're not using our time and energy, wasting our time and energy, doing things that don't really improve our productivity. So that's really the background for this one. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what the discussion actually is out there. So Cal's post, he pointed to a podcast by a guy named Chris Williamson, who I don't know otherwise, but is looking into this stuff with us. And Williamson's phrase is rain dance, productivity rain dance. And again, that just goes back to it's a caricature, really, of us doing all these things with odd and mysterious names in an effort to get something that we don't really have evidence we're going to get. And when we don't get it, we get frustrated and we really don't adopt things that are evidence-based here. And that's really a strange place for us to be because we're business people. We're knowledge workers. And we typically do things because it's evidence-based. Now, I will say the point of both posts, I was a little bit worried about Williamson's post, but both Cal's point and Williamson's point is not that nothing is useful in productivity, so we might as well throw up our hands and get on with it. There's been a little bit of discussion about that. It's like people are like, well, I've tried all these systems, and so now I'm going to try not having a system. And I'm thinking that probably is not the best tactic. So that's certainly not what I'm saying to you here. We'll talk about that in more detail. So it's not that nothing is useful in productivity. It's just that the field is not scientifically organized. And I say this as somebody who's a practitioner in this field. And since it's not scientifically organized, we therefore don't have data about what we're doing. So the takeaway from Cal's post and Chris Williamson's podcast is not stop doing anything or stop doing everything. It's don't make assumptions, but experiment with things, develop data, listen to reasoned arguments about how we do productivity better. And there's a lot of them out there. They're not simple. Rain dances are pretty simple, but they're also based in superstition. So when we experiment, we think, we gather data, we analyze the situation. Experimentation does not normally mean, here's what I feel like. Feelings can be a guide, but I think we can also do better. And particularly with technology, we tend to make some false jumps. We jump on the bandwagon because something's cool. We mistake faster for more productive. We make these typical errors, and there are people trying to sell us stuff that help us make these errors in some cases. But it's not feel, it's let me do something and then let me measure what my outcomes are. I think it's fair to say that technique is a real thing and it exists here. There is technique here. This is not mysterious. There is a better way to manage our tasks and attention. We've just got to find it and process against it. Now, I've done a few episodes on these ideas. So if we look at episode 72, just the one before this, it's on the productivity paradox about the number of tools that we have being a problem, and therefore our systems are disjointed. And the transitions from one system to the next are what cause waste and cause thrashing. Also, episode 64 was about investing in our technique and understanding what our technique needs to be here. And I think that's really important. We're in a situation similar to one we were in 125 or 140 years ago, at the turn of the 19th century, in the 1900s, when nobody had studied what it took to be a good manual factory worker. And Frederick Taylor dropped in and started analyzing the situation and decided that, oh, here's the way things actually are working here. He went in and observed people working. And I think we could usefully do that again. I think that knowledge work is very different from physical work. It has different rules. And I think it's by observing people that are really good at what they do that we understand what those rules are. Now, the problem is that we tend to boil things down into pithy slogans and statements, and that's a function of this, pardon me, rain dance mentality that many of us have here. And at the end of the day, it's just hard work. And experiments are just effortful and designed things that gather data for us. And we use them being the data, to make decisions. But experiments are not easy. You know, we tend to jump from tool to tool to tool, thinking that the new tool is going to be the thing that's going to solve our problem. And that's very seldom true. I would argue that it's almost never been true in the IT world that the tool itself solved the problem. And that's why I alluded to the number of tools and the exchanges from last week's episode. You know, and we're in a discussion about this now in present day because of the advent of AI. And we're deciding, is AI actually a productivity game changer? Or is AI another rain dance? And the data are not in yet. The experimentation is not done. And that's curious to me, why nobody's thought to go and really observe. Now, one answer is knowledge work is a really hard thing to observe, because to the external observer, it may well be sitting around twiddling your thumbs, and then somebody goes, aha, and spits out E equals MC squared, and the whole thing is done, that it's unobservable, that our knowledge work is unobservable. But I do think we can break it down. And with this podcast, I try to break it down to attention. And we know something about attention, and we understand some neurobiology and neuropsychology around how our attention works. And so can we support attention? So that's the evidentiary basis of the attention compass. And I'll link out to Cal's post in the show notes so that you can assess that for yourself and see what it is he actually has to say. So I said the fables that I've talked about previously are in the same vein as these rain dances. And Cal mentioned a couple of things. Williamson gave a few examples of his idea of rain dances. So one of Williamson's is, why do I sit at my desk when I'm not working? There's a superstition that somehow if I'm sitting at my desk, things are going to happen, whether I'm actually working or not. Why do we take phone calls that really have no goal, and we take meetings without a stated goal? Why do we do that? Just in hopes that something good will happen. And I think that's true in practical areas like that, in how do we do what we're doing. I think that my ideas, these fables that I've talked about before, are more habits of thought around specific kinds of tasks. In other words, we think about it in certain ways, so we sort of act out in those ways. One of my favorites is the notion of I'd better do it before I forget about it. We have this thought, something occurs to us, and our logic says, our workflows, work habits tell us, I'd better do it before I forget about it. Now, what that usually actually means is I'd better do it before I forget about it again, because clearly you've already forgotten it the first time. And then it occurs to you and you say, well, I'd better do it before I forget about it. And that's a really interesting phenomenon. And I've joked before, I don't know what is the right time to do whatever it is you're just about to get up and do, but before you forget about it is not that right time. Before you forget about it is a constraint, and it indicates some challenges that we'll get into. I think sometimes we jump to do something, we say, I'd better do it before I forget about it. And what we actually mean is, I'm embarrassed that I forgot about it. And so I'm going to make up for that embarrassment, or I'm going to get rid of my guilt by jumping on it immediately. You can almost hear the thinking behind that. I don't want to be seen as the kind of person who can't remember to do things when they're supposed to be done. And I feel guilty because I'm not any better at my stuff than to forget this. I forgot to feed the dog again. And we feel bad about that. And in order to resolve that, we stop what we're doing, we interrupt ourselves, and we go and we do it now. I don't want the dog to go hungry, or whatever it is. And so we get up, we interrupt ourselves, and we go do it now. And we break our work into small, random sized chunks. Now, I had a former client bring this up to me in kind of a unique way. And so I'll just talk about it a little bit more. She didn't say I'd better do it before I forget about it. She was implementing Attention Compass for the first time. And as we got further into that and she got comfortable with the system and fully implemented it, she wanted to go back to her old system and bring things forward into the new system. And I have a very structured way for doing this. And I think it is important that we do that just so things don't fall through the cracks. But she told me that she had spent a weekend digging out these tasks, and she had come up with 52 of them. And she wanted my advice on how to get these 52 tasks back into the new system. How should she organize them in the new system? Should there be some special way, some big red flag? And we talked about it and thought it through for a little while and came to the conclusion that there was a reason why she didn't get them done the first time. And it wasn't because she forgot about them per se. It's that she prioritized them and then they got out prioritized and she stopped working on them. And once she stopped working on them is when they got forgotten about. So it was more a question of them getting pushed aside. And so we think, it we think that because something's not done, we got to do it. And this is we have a real mental syndrome around not finished as humans. And when we think, ooh, I'd better do it before I forget about it, or it's very close cousin, well, it's halfway done and then I dropped it, so let me pick it up and finish it again, right? That's sort of a knee-jerk reaction, particularly on the unfinished task side. Oh, I've got to finish it because I don't want to be the kind of person that doesn't finish them. That's bad. I was taught that that was bad when I was 12 years old. And what we've got to recognize in both of these cases, both I better do it before I forget about it, and I'd better finish it because I started it, is that our systems, we need to be careful that our systems don't dictate priority. Our systems actually, if they're good systems, actually reflect our prioritization. We have the desire to solve the unsolved task simply because it's undone, it's unsolved. And this tracks back to something that we know about our brains and how our brains work, and that's that incomplete tasks have this greater salience. They're more memorable, they're more exciting to our brain than tasks that are not started or tasks that are already finished. So I would suggest to you that if this happens to you a lot, well, I better do it before I forget about it. Or, hey, I stopped working on that 6 months ago, so I need to pick it back up and push it across the goal line. Then I'd say it's probably your system is broken because it got away from you the first time. You forgot about it the first time, or it got out prioritized the first time, which allowed you to forget about it. And that's a systemic issue. That's you relying on your memory or allowing your priorities to get pushed around too easily. And then, of course, just because it didn't get done, there might be other good reasons why it didn't get done. It might have turned out that you thought it was going to make you $50,000 and you found out it wasn't going to make you $50,000, or you found out that in order to make $50,000, you were going to have to spend $100,000. Any of these things. And so we need to be careful about, in both cases, about the knee-jerk reaction. We need to go back and rethink it, replan it. So don't say, I better do it before I forget about it. Instead, say, I'd better capture it before I forget about it. I'd better get it into my system. And if there's not some part of your system that allows you to do that, then again, I would suggest that it's a problem with your system. Okay? In order to support meaningful productivity for us as knowledge workers, our systems need to have a simple, I'm going to say brainless way to capture. Simple, immediate, things occur to you, you capture them, they go into the system, and the system presents them to you again at a later time so that you can deal with them effectively. So that's one that is, I think, one of these rain dances. I better do it before I forget about it. Here's another one. Okay. We create tasks that at least implicitly mean make progress on X. Okay. And we book some time and we've got a presentation that's due in 2 weeks, and we book an hour and we, quote, move it along, quote, for an hour. And we have no real goal for that hour. We have no concrete subtask that we're going to try and complete. We just get in there and fiddle with it for a while. Okay. I think this puts us in a position where we're beginning to thrash and rapid task switch because we don't make any concrete moves. We don't leave it in a clean place, the task that is. We don't park it in a clean place. We don't identify the next thing that needs to get done. We just put time in against it. And the reason that we do this is because we switch over to time as we're thinking. And when we do that, when we switch over to time, we're actually switching from measuring outputs to measuring inputs. Now, this is because a lot of people stumble when they think about efficiency. And the thought is that faster in and of itself is more efficient. And that's not true. So efficiency is a property of a system. And I talked about this in the previous podcast. Efficiency only makes sense when the goal is clear and when we know a process to achieve the goal. Then and only then do efficiency efforts make sense. So we boil this thing down to an estimate of time, and we think we're doing it the right way because we have a little bit of knowledge about project management, and we know, okay, well, we take this big piece of work and we break it down into little pieces of work, and then we estimate each little piece of work, and then we add all that up, and so then the whole thing just becomes time. And so my goal is to put time against this. And again, time against something is not an output. We're beginning to maximize an input. Oh, I want to put all the time I can against it, right? And it's as if we understand the process. Let me make that clear. If we have a ironclad, well-defined process that has scalability built into it, then we can turn up the gas and go faster, and we can push more inputs into the system. Well, even then, we're probably not pushing inputs into the system, but the system will take some more inputs because it's scalability and we know how to turn up the gas because it's a defined system. Okay. And then the rain dance is to push more input at something in hopes that it will be able to somehow digest that increased amount of input and give us more output. So you see why I say this is a rain dance or a fable. I know it switched over to time, so we push time into this task. Okay. Now, if we look at systems theory, we know that if there's a process, there is a bottleneck. There is a component of that process that dictates the overall speed of the entire system. Now, it may not be the first thing and it may not be the last thing. In fact, it's probably not. It's probably somewhere in the middle. And it takes a fair amount of effort to determine what that bottleneck is. And then once we determine what the bottleneck is, then we've got to figure out some way to expand its capacity. Then and only then are we expanding the capacity of the system. I'll give you a fairly simple example of this. I have been a golfer in my life, and you get on a golf course and it can take 5 and 6 hours to play a round of golf, which makes it take way too long. You're way too tired when you get done. I live in Alabama. We don't want to be outside for 5 or 6 hours at a time because it's really hot. And that's not good, but this sort of thing happens out there. And it's interesting because in some ways, a golf course is a process. And that's because two rules in golf. One is you don't hit a ball into the group of people in front of you. You got to wait for them to get out of the way to move on with what they're doing before you hit your next shot. And then the other rule is that you can ask the group in front of you if you can play through, but there's certain times when that's appropriate and other times when they're not. So what happens then on the golf course, you can imagine, is the slowest person on the golf course dictates how long it's going to take everybody to finish. Because people in front of that slowest person are going to go ahead and finish because by definition, they're faster. They're going to go ahead and finish. And that slowest person is going to move through their process. And everybody behind that slowest person is going to be waiting on that slowest person. And so however many people are behind the slowest one, right? It's like a car on a one lane, no pass road. The faster cars just stack up. The faster cars catch up, and there's nowhere for them to go, so they stack up. Well, that's the idea of a bottleneck in a system. Okay, the bottleneck governs the throughput of the entire system. And so, to the degree that we're trying to speed up the system, any improvements that we make that don't increase the throughput of the bottleneck are waste, because you're making somebody in front of the bottleneck faster, and they're just going to get out of the way, and that doesn't increase the overall throughput of the system. Or you're increasing the speed of somebody behind the bottleneck, which is just going to get them to the bottleneck faster, and they're just going to have to wait longer. Now, we take these things and we try and do bits of them quickly. And again, we're thinking through this, just putting inputs in order to try to speed the system up, that we don't know to be useful. So we've got to get in, we've got to understand, and we've got to measure and take the time to think through what the process is, and then identify the bottleneck, and then go to work on the bottleneck. Okay? We can't just increase inputs because it's expensive. So we start thinking in terms of, well, I'm going to increase the inputs. What we're actually doing is we're doing the opposite of more productive. Because remember, efficiency, productivity is this equation. It's outputs divided by inputs. And so if you increase the number of inputs without increasing the number of outputs, then your efficiency goes down. And so when we start just putting time against these projects, just saying, well, I'm going to book an hour here and an hour there and an hour the other place, we're increasing inputs without understanding the process well enough to know whether or not we're actually affecting a bottleneck. So we don't get more productivity, we don't get more efficiency, and we wind up, again, with a rain dance. Now, there's a lot of discussion in these various posts that I referred to earlier, and I'll get them linked so that you can find them and check up on the discussion yourself. But some commentary. So one of the things that Williamson talks about that's on his list is this idea of slavishly getting to inbox zero. And he says that's a rain dance. Well, it depends on how you look at it, in my opinion. I think we want to have inbox zero. But it's not just for the sake of inbox zero. Emails are inputs to the system. And occasionally they're outputs as well, but usually they're inputs. And we're not doing inbox zero just for the sake of inbox zero, because it has no value in and of itself. So the reason that we want to do inbox zero is because inbox zero tells us that we've processed that information channel completely. It's not that we've answered every email. It's just that we've dealt with every email. We've assessed every email. So I think perhaps some people believe that inbox zero means that I've answered every email. You can't answer every email. But instead, inbox zero means I've processed it, I've assessed it, I've identified whether there's something for me to do there. And if so, I've got it somewhere on a list and I'm going to get taken care of at the appropriate time. So inbox zero, for the sake of seeing the little icon at the bottom of your Gmail box, is in fact a rain dance. But we want to process it because that way we can know all of our commitments. Now, if you're doing inbox zero for the sake of inbox zero, yes, that's a rain dance. I decided long ago that my phone and my email address are almost completely for my convenience. And I say almost completely because it's also for the convenience of people that I really care about. But I get a lot of people that I don't really care about, who want to use that convenience against me. So if I'm trying to just answer every email, then I'm going to lose that battle. And I'm going to lose it in addition to wasting a bunch of time trying to get to the goal. So again, we've got to think about these things carefully and decide what they actually do for us before we decide whether or not to do them. I'll give you another idea of a rain dance. A lot of tweaking of your system is probably a rain dance. And we buy lots of tools and we switch lots of tools and we try a tool and we either get bored with it or we think it's not going to work or we decide that somehow it's not living up to its promise or whatever that is that we do. And then we switch to another tool. Well, despite what the IT software people tell you, every tool that they put out has a learning curve. And the correlation is the more valuable, the more powerful the tool is, the steeper the learning curve usually. AI, for example, has a learning curve. And there are people that have climbed that learning curve on your behalf. And before you can implement AI, you've got to walk that learning curve. And probably the best way to do it is to hire a Sherpa or a coach that's already been there. Okay. And so that's an example. And the more we switch, the more these learning curves we face. And learning curves take significant persistence in addition to significant time. Because learning by its very definition is a frustrating activity. It takes lots of energy because you're going to fail a lot while you're learning. So if we're tweaking the system, then, a couple of things happen. One is we're facing this learning curve all the time. Another is we buy tools to speed up parts of the process. And again, this could easily get back into the bottleneck problem. Only throughput of the bottleneck matters when we want to increase the throughput of the system. Can we increase the throughput of the bottleneck? If so, then we'll get more throughput on the system. But we've got to have identified the bottleneck. Okay, well, we buy tools and we say, oh, this tool will do X part of the system faster. And that doesn't change the capacity of the overall system. And then we get frustrated and we go, oh, okay, well, that didn't work and that didn't help me. So I'm going to either throw that one away and get another one, or I'm going to adopt a new tool for a different part of the process. Well, what we need to do is we need to sit down and we need to think through what the bottleneck is and what the best way is to address that. You don't need a system to help you handle email faster. What you need is a system to reduce the amount of email you have to deal with. Faster in and of itself is not going to help you. So that's because email is normally an input to the system. And as we've said, increasing the amount of input doesn't automatically make the system faster. In fact, in many cases, it will actually make it slow. And this, again, is this systems theory kind of thing that we've been talking about a little bit. And again, you're increasing the inputs, but not changing the outputs, which is the opposite of efficiency and productivity. That makes increasing the inputs with the same number of outputs makes productivity go down. So we've got to be really careful. And we'll need to reach out and really consider our system and our process and really think about what is our output. What is the thing that we produce that actually creates value for other people? And in knowledge work, this can be a challenging question. In product work, it's challenging as well, but not to the same degree. Because if you're in the tire business, you produce tires. Presumably, you've defined tires that people want, and that there is a market for said tires, and that demand exceeds the amount of tires that you're making right now, so you can make some more and usefully sell them into the market and create value, and thus create income. In knowledge work, it's somewhat harder because of the intangibility of information. And we don't really know what produces the value for our customers all the time. And if you think about what you're doing, does the spreadsheet that you're producing produce value for them? Does the presentation that you're creating produce value for them? Would a prettier presentation produce more value for them? Or is it the information inside the presentation that produces value? If it's the information is intangible. How much information do they need? What kind of information? How should it be presented? So these are all things about identifying the outputs that make us valuable in the world. And then as we can clearly identify those outputs and deal with those outputs effectively, then we can walk backwards into the system and say, okay, what do we do with the system that produces these outputs? And back into it and measure it and experiment with it. And that's really what has to be done. Okay. So that's a lot of stuff, a lot of thinking. We've talked about this notion of rain dances and how do we avoid getting into rain dances. And that's similar to the fables or lies of productivity that I've talked about here on the podcast. And we'll talk about some more again. We've identified a few specific cases and talked about why are they rain dances, why are they superstitions, and why do they not improve our productivity in the ways we want our productivity to be improved. And we said, okay, we need to measure. And we need to identify, and we need to be scientific. We need to experiment on our systems. So we've got this notion of a rain dance, this idea that we're doing things that really don't matter. And rain dance, fable, superstition, all these words are trying to describe the same idea. Now, through our analysis here, what have we done? We've identified a principle or two, meaning if you want productivity and efficiency, then you really have to dig down and define your outputs. That's a principle. Define what your output is, what produces value in your world. And you have to identify those outputs very cleanly. Because if you're not clear on what they are, then it gets really hard to identify the process that produces them. And then you focus on that output and you work backwards in the system, experimenting along the way if you need to make sure that you're producing data. If you think the PowerPoint that you're doing is the most valuable thing, but you're not entirely sure, don't guess. Start asking your customers. Start gathering data. Start experimenting. It's the guesses that lead to the rain dances. So we're in this process where we're identifying, defining our outputs, and we're looking through and understanding the path that it takes to get those outputs created. And then we can focus on those steps, and then we back into the process so that we can then identify the bottleneck. If we need to increase our speed, then the bottleneck is where we go. But identifying a bottleneck is not a trivial challenge, even in a physical process. It's not a trivial challenge. It has a lot to do with where does inventory back up. And that's a hard thing to identify in a informational knowledge work process. What constitutes inventory? So I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it requires a lot of effort, a lot of thought. And I'll submit that I've done some of that on your behalf. So we've talked about identifying a bottleneck is not a trivial challenge. We've talked about how to do it. We've talked a lot about the notion that faster by itself is not more productive. Faster by itself is just faster. And it could be that just increases the speed of our thrashing. It could be that we're just producing inventory, or even worse, we're producing waste at a faster clip. Now, many of the things that we've identified and talked about, and I brought this up on a couple of examples, many of these symptoms indicate that your system is broken or incomplete. So we talked about, if you're consistently saying things like, well, I better do it before I forget about it, okay? Your problem is that you're forgetting about things. So how does your system help you not forget about things? Well, step one is to make sure your system helps you capture these things and that you're doing a good job of capturing in your system. If you identify that you're consistently going back to a task, say several times a month, you go, oh, I forgot to feed the dog. Then what you want to look at is feed the dog in your system somewhere? If not, then how are you going to get it in there? So it may be broken around your capture mechanism. It may be broken around the means by which you move things into the system that you become aware of. How do you put tasks in the system? That's this capture mechanism. It may be broken around your reminder system, which is how do you let yourself know that something has been postponed and to pick it back up again at an appropriate time. So these principles that I'm talking about here are all things that we talk about when we look at an attention compass implementation. An attention compass literally is built with these ideas in mind. And by that, I mean, when we implement attention compass, we define what capture is and we deal with it directly. It's a step in our process. And so the system is a good system of capture. So fewer things are stuck in our heads where we tend to forget them. We talk about specific ways, very precise ways that reminders work, and what different kind of reminders are good for and not good for. In a previous podcast, one of the things I've identified for you is this notion of alarm-based reminders. And when alarm-based reminders are what you need versus a process-based reminder. And if it's a process-based reminder that you need, then we got to think about how do you implement that? How do you put that into your system? Because the tools that you have probably don't include a ton of process-based reminders. They're almost all alarm-based. One of the challenges here, though, is that all of this really frustrates people. We do our rain dance and it doesn't rain. And it's like, something's wrong, but I don't know what. And so do we do our rain dance harder? Do we switch rain dances and get a different rain dance? Or do we use that frustration as fuel for us to go back in and redesign the system? Now, we want and we need a system as knowledge workers a system that's complete and not broken, that doesn't let things fall through the cracks, where somebody has thought this through and experimented with the different components of the system such that we manage our information better, more efficiently, with less thrashing and less forgetting and less waste. And I'll submit to you that that system, as it stands right now, is the attention compass. I'd love to talk with you more about this idea. If you're interested, I'm not hard to find. You can reach out to me at larry@dobusywrite.com. And if you stumbled across this podcast somehow, then you may want to go to dobusywrite.com and find the podcast because it's published there as well. And that way you can reach out to me there. In addition, I'm active on LinkedIn. That's the only social network that I use. And so if you're there, you can reach out to me. We can connect there and begin to have the kind of discussions that are really going to help you improve your productivity and help you get rid of any rain dances that might have found their way into your process. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the attention compass process. Attention compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusywrite.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.